Okay, so last week we talked about nature and why artists include nature as a theme in their artwork. Today what I wanted to do is show you just some short examples of how you can create texture in your work once you come up with a composition. So you're going to have to figure out where you want texture. It can be plain texture that fits with the thing that you're drawing, or it could be more abstract and be a form of texture that might not normally fit into that animal. It's totally up to you. One of the first things I'm going to show you is a texture plate. And what's great about these texture plates is they have these repeated bumps in them that make it easier for us to draw a texture onto our paper. Okay, you could hand draw all these little bumps that are on here, but that would take a lot longer. So what I'm going to do for this is I put it under the paper, I get a crayon, and when I rub that crayon, now this has to be done with a crayon, otherwise it doesn't work. It won't work with marker or oil pastel. When I get a crayon and I rub it across, I now have some texture. Now what I can do is I can push light on this crayon and get a light value, and I can push really heavy on it and get a really dark, vibrant. Some of your crayons that are really light are not going to pop as much with these texture plates. So like example, this yellow, the contrast against that white paper, it does not show as well because they're so similar. So if you're using white paper, you want to use like a darker color or something that's going to really show those areas that were popping on that plate. And basically, like you see, they're just repeated dots which create that texture. So that's that. Now if you're going to hand draw texture yourself, there's different ways to do it. So I have these really quick drawings I did. If you're going to do an animal, a lot of times lines and shapes can be repeated to create texture. So let's say I want to make this bear kind of hairy. So I would go in with short little lines just like this, either with a pencil or a Sharpie marker. And what that does is that creates texture to look like the texture of hair you would see in your bear in real life. I can also go in for tree trunks. I can do some lines in tree trunks to make it look rougher, or the texture that you would see in a tree. Those different broken up, jagged pieces of bark. If I wanted to make something look fluffy, let's pretend this was a cloud, I can go in and repeat little wavy, soft lines, and that's going to give it a fluffy look. If I have something like this, let's say this was a dragon eye, I could repeat shapes to get texture. So I could repeat maybe half circles over and over. What ends up forming are these really neat scaly textures. You can even do circles repeated over and over, which is basically the same thing we did with a texture plate. We just used a different material. We repeated circles with a texture plate. This could be something with like a frog or something that has a little bit of a texture like this. So that's how you can draw in texture, repeated lines or shapes. The last thing you can do is paint, and you can either collage the paint later or apply the paint to your artwork. This is acrylic paint. Now, if I wanted to draw texture like I did with a pencil, but with a paintbrush, I want a nice fine bottom paintbrush, and I could, just like I did that time, like Van Gogh did, I can repeat lines or shapes over and over to eventually get a texture. So that kind of reminds me of like a lizard or something that would be scaly. But you can also use different tools to create those textures. So like this paintbrush that has different bristles at the bottom is naturally going to repeat a line to create texture. So if I was to add paint to this paintbrush and drag it quickly across my paper, it gives it that scratchy texture. Or if I was to use this dry bristled brush, add a little paint, and that's going to give you a little texture too. So if you're doing something like maybe grass, you're doing a painting and you have grass in it, I always love to do this in my paintings, is I just get a nice dry brush like this and I pull my brush down And look, it's got a nice texture like grass. And you can see because of the way the bristles are spread out, it's just creating those repeated lines to create texture. So as you saw, we just repeated shapes and lines to get texture, but there's different ways and materials and how we can do that, okay? It's up to you in your artwork how you apply these tools and what you decide to use, but you need to incorporate texture in your work.